Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
China's consumer prices maintained stable momentum in May. A flying car factory begins operation in Guangzhou. And prospects for a ceasefire between Iran and the United States grow dim as they trade retaliatory attacks. Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our first story. The National Bureau of Statistics says China's consumer prices saw mild growth in May. Consumer price index rose 1.2% year-on-year last month, while core CPI, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, edged up 1.1%. The producer price index, which measures costs for goods and the factory gate, rose 3.9%. For more, we're joined by Yao Shujie, Cheung Kong Professor of Economics at Chongqing University. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. First of all, China's CPI rose 1.2% last month. What does this tell us about the current state of consumer demand and economic recovery?
It is a continual growth of the CPI above the 1% level. So 1.2% is encouraging in a sense that consumer confidence is coming back steadily. That is a continuation of the previous months. So the Chinese economy probably is bottoming out, and I hope that in the rest of the year, this trend will continue. So the CPI and later on we see the PPI, they are significant, positive significance, suggesting that the economy, not only in the consumption but also in the production, is recovering fairly strongly. Also, last month there is a holiday, the Man-Day holidays, which reflect the strong demand of consumers for going out for the holiday and spending. So it is encouraging news.
And you mentioned that last month there was a major holiday and there was a lot of consumption booming. Also, Chinese policymakers have been looking to shift growth toward consumption. Is the services sector finally playing that role more meaningfully?
The service sector is already a most important sector in the Chinese economy. Normally, we're talking about the traditional agriculture, the first industries, and then the manufacturing industry and also the services. Now, services is now awaiting the other two economy sector. So it will continue to play an increasingly role in stimulating China's aggregate economy development. Now, it also have to have some consideration whether this consumption and services will continue. Much of this prediction is based on the prices. If consumers are willing to pay for the services and the product they want to buy, then the price will be stable or increase. Now the CPI, as in this case, 1.2%, although it is still moderate, it's not very high, but compared to the previous year and also the early months of this year, it is a significant improvement. So the government is paying more and more attention to stimulating the development of the service sector and stimulating consumption. So consumption, not only for now, but also for the future, it will play an increasingly important role. Because after all, economic development is for the people's happiness. And if people are willing to spend, if people have more money to spend, and they have job security, they will be able to spend. So this is the concept, the ultimate goal of economic development anyway, not only for the steady economic growth, but also for serving the development goal of sustaining people's happiness.
Then the PPI was also higher. It was up 3.9%. What do you think is behind this growth?
This is quite shocking to me. I mean, PPI, remember not too long ago, we were fairly concerned. They are in the fairly significant negative territory. And the PPI come up so strongly in the last couple of months, particularly in May this year, which is quite, significant. 3.9% is pretty high, to be honest. But why it is high? I think there are some possible explanation. Firstly, PPI for a significant periods of time, it was growing negatively. And that means there is a leg bounce to a positive territory. And this leg bounce is quite strong. The second explanation is probably due to the production system, which is getting highly dynamic because people's demand is geared towards some sorts of new energy vehicles and also ordinary vehicles and other things, durable goods. So the price is actually driven by the non-ferrous metal processing and energies. Of course, energy is affected because of the Middle East crisis. The oil price jump in April and continue in May, although there's a slight decline, but it was fairly high in April. So this is why the PPI is 3.9% is pretty high. I hope it will be stabilized because we don't want it to be too high, but we also don't want it to be too low. And this is some sort of signal. It's encouraging in a sense that because in the past it's highly negative and now it is highly significant, positive. But for the policymakers and also the local government and the market entities, they have to watch out that this price shouldn't be going too fast because otherwise it will dent the market economy in a sense that if the price is too high, then some producers or consumers, they may find it very costly for the product and services they buy. So we have to wait to see how PPI could be stabilized in the coming months.
And then how will the current CPI and PPI growing trends bring any influence to our ordinary residents' lives?
Well, for the ordinary citizen, is more or less affected by the CPI rather than the PPI. But in the medium term, the PPI could be feel to the CPI market. It means from the producers to the consumers. But in the short term, I think consumer is more concerned about the CPI, particularly the agricultural food product, which is fairly stable or even decline. So it would not affect the lower end income people, to my view. So in the short term, there's nothing to worry about. It means that the Chinese consumer are still facing a fairly good, steady consumer product markets. They are not yet suffering by the rising prices. To some extent, CPI is still relatively low. So this is good news actually for the consumer, but it may not be highly attractive for the macro economy in a sense that we don't want a fairly low CPI. We just want a moderate CPI. Let's say something like 2% is probably for most economists and policymakers, they were considered to be ideal level. CPI and PPI could be, to some extent, decoupled because CPI affect consumer and PPI affect producers.
And it's noticeable that the consumer prices and producer prices are rising at very different rates. How should we interpret this gap, and what does it reveal about the current economic conditions in China?
The current economic condition, there's pro and con. Or, in the pro side, the potential is still there, and the dynamism is still there. and the policy makers is very clear of what they are doing. And China, as I said before, the economic system become highly sophisticated, and policy makers have to strike the balance between different economic sector, between different economic localities. But on the main, I think Chinese economy is highly steady. It is highly resilient to the possible changes in the external environment. For example, like the Middle East crisis, Iran, America, and Israel, and also the Middle East, there was a very intensive conflict among the country I just mentioned, from the late, February through to March and April, and even continue to now. It's still not stopping. And China, show up a fairly strong degree of resilience to this kind of external shock. China also demonstrated resilience to the shock of the Ukraine crisis and also the pandemic. So in a sense, the macroeconomy of China is fairly steady, and they saw continued growth. Last year, we still achieved a 5% growth, and this year will continue to be 4.5 to 5%. So I'm quite confident. As you look at the last month's import and export data, measured in US dollar terms, Chinese foreign trade increased by almost 20%, over 19.5%, to be more precise. And this means that the Chinese product are needed by the rest of the world. I'm sure if the consumer in China gain their confidence, they have the capacity to spend, they have the capacity to stimulate a unified domestic markets. So this is a very strong basis. The con is that because China is still facing this very uncertain foreign environment, and domestically China is enduring a very significant industrial transformation. As we mentioned, traditionally agricultural manufacturing, they were dominant, and nowadays services, especially the high-end manufacturing services, they become more and more dominant. And this transformation is good for the long-term economic development, but in the short term, it does have some sort of rather painful effect on the local market labor environment. Some people, they have to change job, and some enterprises, they have to change their services and product line. The shop on the high street, and also the internet, they have to change because of the AI technology, because the internet of things, they are affecting their life. For some people, they have some sort of short-term pain. And this short-term pain, if you go to the society level, you interview people individually, it could be rather difficult for them. But on the main, this is probably unavoidable because China is enduring this kind of transformation. So yes, these two challenges, external risk and internal transformation. But personally, I think in the medium and longer term, China will still be able to demonstrate these kinds of dynamism and also resilience. And after some time, it will gear to a higher level. And then the difficulty will become more manageable, and the opportunity will become more ample for the people, not only the people who are looking for jobs, but also the people who are already in the job market.
Thank you very much. That was Yao Shujie, Chiang Kong Professor of Economics at Chongqing University. Coming up, how is the Global South's push for a greater voice reshaping the world's human rights system? This is World Today. Stay tuned. This week, Beijing is hosting a major forum on global human rights governance, drawing officials, scholars, and representatives from nearly 100 countries, the United Nations, and other international and regional organizations. Marking 40 years since the UN adopted the Declaration on the Right to Development, our special interview series continues to examine how the global conversation on human rights is changing. In today's program, my colleague Gao Yingshi speaks with Helen Han, co-founder and Secretary General of the Beijing Club for International Dialogue. Their conversation looks at how the post-war human rights system, largely shaped by Western powers, is now being reshaped as emerging powers and countries across the global south push for a greater voice. Let's take a listen.
The current international human rights framework was largely shaped after World War II, mostly by Western powers. Does that origin still define whose voice counts today, and is that changing?
I think the tendency is that the current system still wants to dominate. However, the global South countries need to speak out more. So I think the rhetoric is evolving significantly, especially after the pandemic, the wars in Gaza and Iran, etc. If we reflect, we can see the post-war or the World War II human rights system emerged largely from institutions and the political ideas, shaped by Western powers. Its core principles, such as human dignity, equality, freedom in politics, have achieved near universal recognition. However, debates continue over whose experiences are represented in this system. Today, emerging powers and countries across the global south are increasingly seeking a greater role and a greater voice in shaping or in facilitating the new shape of human rights norms, emphasizing on development, social stability, and economic and educational rights, alongside these political freedoms. So as global power becomes more diffuse, the conversation is gradually becoming more inclusive. The tensions, however, remain over how universal principles should be interpreted and implemented.
Beijing places strong emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference when it comes to human rights. Critics in the West call this as a shield against accountability. How do you read that emphasis?
China's emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference reflects both historical experience, China's own experience, and a broader belief that each country should determine and have the capacity and the capability to determine its own path of political and social development. Beijing argues that external pressure can undermine stability and disregard national circumstances, not to mention the geopolitical situation, usually shaped by the Western powers. However, the critics always said that sovereignty should not prevent scrutiny when serious human rights concerns and the violation arise. So the debate ultimately centers on where the balance should lie between respecting national autonomy and upholding international standards. In my opinion, sovereignty should be regarded as a safeguard against politicization, especially when it comes to these very domestic affairs. Do not use the human rights issue as somewhat the universal standard, because each country has its own stage and the situation of its political and social and economic development. When the critics worry it can limit accountability, I think both perspectives should be taken care of and should be kind of tailor-made to highlight this balance between international relations and its own social and economic and political development within a country.
One recurring tension is the charge of double standards. So when Western governments raise human rights selectively, loud on some countries while silent on others, how does that affect the credibility of the whole conversation?
Yes, accusations of double standards can definitely weaken the credibility of human rights advocacy. When governments appear to criticize adversaries while overlooking similar concerns among its allies, many countries perceive human rights discourse as very politically motivated rather than based on principles. So this perception and this, on-the-spot practice can significantly reduce the trust in international institutions. So at the same time, selective enforcement does not necessarily invalidate the underlying principles themselves. So the challenge is to ensure greater consistency and transparency in how concerns are raised. An ideal human rights framework can see how to apply equally to all states and on the same issues, or use some principles and similar standards on some domestic issues. And these can exercise the legitimacy and encourage the genuine international conversation and the cooperation.
China views human rights as something built through dialogue and cooperation rather than pressure and sanctions. In practice, what does that alternative approach actually look like?
China's approach in the past decades emphasized engagement, capacity building, and economic development as foundations for advancing and advocating human rights on the world stage. In practice, this means supporting technical cooperation, development assistance, non-interference. On China's case, this also means and be translated into poverty reduction initiatives, bilateral dialogue rather than sanctions. Chinese institutions, government agencies, and officials and the practitioners argue that improving living standards, raise the standards of education, raise the standards of healthcare, infrastructure, building, all together create the conditions necessary for a broader human rights well-being. So China's practices and approaches can certainly be learned and be listened more as a very effective and alternative approach.
As more countries in the global south assert their own paths, are we moving toward a more pluralistic idea of human rights? And can the existing international institutions adapt to that?
I think this is developing alongside what we called a multipolar world. So it needs a more diverse understanding of human rights as it is emerging, especially countries from the global south gain momentum in gaining the greater influence in global governance. So many advocate a broader agenda that can give increased attention to each and every country in the global south in their social development, in their poverty reduction, the collective rights for the specific countries. Alongside the cultural diversity is also a very important area to emphasize the tailor-made human rights movement or campaign. So these are alongside the traditional civil and political rights shaped and be a natural part of the rhetoric shaped by the Western powers post-World War II. This does not necessarily mean that abandoning some of the universal principles, but rather debating and advocating how they should be prioritized and applied, because each country is so different and we encourage the diversity of the country's development. So the existing institutions, of course, they face the challenge of accommodating a wider range of perspectives while preserving some common or universal standards. So in the long term, legitimacy may depend on the global south countries' ability to remain and advocate this inclusive, representative, and responsive to evolving global and the realities and the current development in each and every country in the global south.
That was Helen Han, co-founder and Secretary General of the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, talking to my colleague Gao Yingshi. More to come, a flying car factory begins operation in Guangzhou. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back after a short break.
name is Alessandro Golombieski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're listening to World Today with me, Do Hongyu, in Beijing. A smart manufacturing base for flying cars has begun operation in the Chinese city of Guangzhou with an annual capacity of 100 units. The vehicles can fit 2 people and have a maximum range of 30 kilometers. It's received tentative orders for over 2,000 units. The low-altitude economy is an emerging pillar industry that China is fostering during the 15th five-year plan period that begins this year. For more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
So Yan, China plans to make the low-altitude economy a new pillar industry during the 15th five-year plan period. What is driving this policy priority?
Well, I think there are 2 major reasons for why the low-altitude economy is seen as a pillar, because I think it ultimately serves as a primary engine to cultivate the so-called new quality productive forces. So in other words, the low-altitude technologies, when it comes to drones, the vertical landing and taking off vehicles, these machines, these devices, they very much are tech intensive. They rely heavily on advanced batteries, lightweight carbon fiber materials, electric propulsions, and autonomous AI systems. So in other words, this industry, as it's developing, is going to help to upgrade industrial supply chain and achieve industrial innovations. So that's why there's so much emphasis on the low-altitude economy. In addition to that, I think from the demand side, this low-altitude economy is really promising to cultivate, new demands for these, passenger flights, for eVTOL urban transport, for low-altitude tourism. So all of this could also help to elevate the demand in the economy. And lastly, I think this is also a promising industry to transform urban transportation system. It could help to overcome, urban and logistic bottlenecks. So for example, in the very dense traffic areas, with these kinds of flying cars, it helped to promote urban transportation. It also helped to, fill the gap of the last mileage kind of delivery. So all of this, I think, are really important reasons for why the sector is considered really promising, as it promises to generate, over 10 trillion yuan by the end of the 2050.
And as you mentioned, some analysts say the flying cars could create a market of over 10 trillion yuan. So where do you see the biggest commercial opportunities in the next 5 years?
Well, I think the largest market that I think would be the best opportunity for fast growing is really in urban transport. So in other words, when you look at the urban sort of transportation, right, from airport to city shuttles or intercity air taxis, I think this could be the biggest revenue generation for this kinds of technologies. But in terms of the fastest growth, I think logistics and cargo, especially heavy payload cargo eVTOLs, can dominate the regional supply chain. So with these delivery system, I think this is where you can see fast growing revenues. But in terms of the immediate, I would say, cash flows, I can see that in the low altitude tourism, because I think companies like Yihang has already successfully secured operational certifications for sightseeings. So these flying cars could fly over predefined geofenced low risk routes. So this could help to promote the kind of tourism and scenic sightseeing uses of the technology. And finally, I think another area that is likely to see growth is in the specialized public services. So, for example, in medical evacuation, in disaster response and firefighting, these public services could really utilize the technologies. So in terms of, I think the biggest revenues, it's going to be urban transport, but fast growing could be logistics, immediate cash flow could be the low altitude tourism. And then I think the very socially beneficial areas would be public services.
And South China's Guangdong province has achieved positive results in the low altitude economic development. So how do you explain that?
Well, I think there are both supply side and demand side factors. So when you look at Guangdong province, it controls the world's most complete drone and eVTOL supply chain. It manufactures pretty much 95% of China's consumer drones and 54% of the industrial drones. So from the supply side, I think Guangdong really has the unmatched in terms of its supply chain. So you have, multiple cities that could really help to conjure up the supply chain together. So Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and other cities around could really help to bring the resources together, bring the components and parts together to assemble these low altitude devices, the flying cars. So I think from the supply side, there's the benefits. And then from the demand side, because Guangdong province is really the core of the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area. And this area is, has a great potential to utilize the intercity, urban transportation using the kinds of flying cars. So I think using the flying vehicles could really help the regional integration in this area. And so, and also for sightseeing, testing, Zhuhai is very good for that. So in that sense, I think, both from the supply side and demand side, I think Guangdong is a perfect place for these, the flying cars industries to take off, or the broader low altitude economy. And lastly, I would also say that, Shenzhen passes China's first local legislation dedicated to the low altitude economy. So in other words, this region is also having very aggressive and progressive policy push and the local regulations to really promote the industry. And by the way, I think right now, the province now is hosting over 15,000 low altitude enterprises, accounting for over 30% of the national total. So that means Guangdong is going to continue to play a lead role to roll out the low altitude economy.
And how does China's development of the flying car industry compare with that in the US, Europe, and other countries, do you think?
China really leads in the world in terms of the mass production scaling of the flying cars. Again, because China has the dominant in battery technologies and has really successful, sort of the history of building, EVs and many of these consumer electronics. So that gives China the technological advantages of developing the flying cars industry. And couple that with China's really, competent and very mature, robust supply chain that allow China to turn ideas, protocols into mass production, and quickly also to make these products affordable. I think that really gives China a lot of a lead in developing the, flying car and low altitude economy. Not to mention, China also leads in the world when it comes to regulatory execution to promote the industries. United States, they still have, cutting edge aviation and software automation. And Europe, they also have advanced mechanical and structural engineering. But I think in terms of turning this technology into actual, product to mass production and adoption, I think China is far ahead in that regard.
And China has become a global leader in electric vehicles. So does China have the ingredients to become a leader in flying cars as well?
I think so. So I think China has a lot of advantages. For one is, the government has really the vision and the strategy to develop the industries. As you mentioned earlier, the 15 5-year plan is promoting, the low altitude economy with industrial policies, with regulatory, framework and so on. So I think that would help to really, roll down this economy, this industry. And second is China has the technological advantages. As I mentioned earlier, China, especially companies like CATL, they are developing very quickly the aviation grade condensed batteries that could help to bring up the energy density, to a very high level. So I think the kinds of battery technologies would also very helpful. And third is that China has already the pre-existing EV supply chain. So, eVTOLs and other flying cars, they really rely on many of the kind of materials like the lightweight carbon fibers and the high efficiency electric motors and so on and so forth that EV needs. So, when you already have the supply chain, then it's much easier to scale up and produce these eVTOLs. And also, lastly, I think China, again, has that speed. It has really unrivaled speed to market compared to other companies, other countries. So I think that's also gives China a lot of advantages. So we talked about, Xiaopeng's Aero HT is now manufacturing these flying cars in Guangzhou, and they're expecting to, start the mass production this year and deliver, thousands of these flying cars by the end of this year. So I think all of these, the first mover advantages would also allow China to continue to capitalize on its strengths in the EV, in these flying cars industries.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University. Coming up, prospects for a ceasefire between Iran and the United States grow dim as they trade retaliatory attacks. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I'm Yan Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
Welcome back. Iranian media reports that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has launched drone attacks on the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and U.S. military bases in Jordan and Kuwait. This came after the U.S. military said it carried out what it calls self-defense strikes against Iran. President Donald Trump said Tehran shot down a U.S. Apache helicopter near the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has vowed retaliation for any future U.S. attack. The fresh hostilities further strained the ceasefire after Iran and Israel traded missile attacks in a recent major escalation. For more on this, we're joined by Dr. Wang Jin, an expert on Middle East affairs. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wang.
It's my great pleasure.
First of all, what do you think triggered this round of tit-for-tat military actions of Iran and the United States?
Well, I think the several factors lead to finally the outbreak of the new round of the conflict between the United States, Iran, and Israel. I think the very fundamental one is that the stalemate, the standoff, still continues for the negotiation table between the United States and Iran. And so this means that ceasefire status is still very fragile. And it's very likely that any kind of the risk, any kind of the uncertainty would bring both sides, I mean, Iran and the United States, back to the war scenario. So that's why I think we could see very clearly that during the past days, the conflict started again between the United States, Iran, between Iran and Israel. And also, on the other hand, I think one of the very important factors is that given that there were no clear line of how and what should be done for the maintenance of the ceasefire in this region. So that's why Iran, United States, and Israel, they actually been trying to seek new measures to so-called protect themselves or enhance their own influence in this region. So against this backdrop that different parties, they are easily to clash with each other to seek and to enhance their own perspective of the kind of the security scenario. So that's why we have already witnessed that the war come back again, the conflict will come back again. And that's why it's make the things that's so difficult to end. I mean, this kind of a conflict is so difficult to end, and this conflict might be erupted in the future again, if very poorly managed by the related parties.
The Iranian attacks targeted the U.S. assets in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. Why are these locations strategically important for Iran, and what messages might Iran be trying to send?
Well, I think Iran's message is very clear because from these countries who are targeted, they believe that Iran now is actually threatening new kind of the attacks against their own territories. But from Iranians' perspective, they believe they target these countries because, as you mentioned, they are not targeting these countries' own territory. They are just attacking these countries' military, United States military bases and military assets inside this country. So that's why from the perspective of Iranians, they believe they are attacking United States presence rather than attacks against these countries' own sovereignty and territory. So that's why this kind of the clashing perspective prevail. And from Iranians' perspective, they believe they have the legal rights to do this. But maybe from the regional countries, as you mentioned, Bahrain, Kuwait, and even Jordan, who has harbored the United States military bases and presence, these things would be very, very difficult to be understood by Iran. So that's why I think in the future we're talking about different clashes of different perspective of understandings of the regional security arrangements, and this kind of the conflicts and the clashes will continue, unfortunately.
Iran has vowed retaliation for any future U.S. attack. So what options does Tehran have for responding while trying to avoid a full-scale war?
Well, I think a lot of things could be done to avoid the full-scale war. First of all, let's be frank. Actually, United States, Israel, and Iran, they have already maintained and expressed a very rational attitudes towards each other, although the war started. And we could witness very clearly that after the war started, although they all expressed very, very assertive stances, but then nearly all of them, maintain that now the war finished. Now that they finished their rounds of attacks, so that's why they don't want new conflict and the clashes erupted. So that's why they're showing and their expression are very, very restrained and rational. And second one, I think, as we mentioned, fundamentally they have resulted from the ongoing stalemate and standoff between different parties. So that's why the only solution, fundamentally solving this problem, is to reach the kind of agreement based on the different countries' own concessions over each other. So these things are determined by the future's negotiation table. What should be done? I think maybe more mediation and more peaceful efforts should be brought in. And last but not least, I think the trust efforts between different sides should be further introduced, because actually now the United States does not trust Iran. Iran does not trust Israel. And Israel, actually, to some extent, their trust towards the United States also weakened. So how to rebuild the trust is very, very crucial.
And Dr. Wang, how serious is this crossfire in the larger picture of the current confrontation in the Middle East? And how is it affecting efforts to de-escalate the crisis?
Well, I think actually it's very serious, because when we're talking about this conflict, although everybody shows kind of restraint attitudes or the rational attitude, this does not mean that these conflicts are not dangerous. It actually is any kind of the clashes, any kind of the conflict might be further erupted and further be escalated into a larger round of war that could bring everybody inside into the much more dangerous scenarios. So that's why I think any conflict should be avoided. So that's why when we are talking about how to end this war, we mean that first of all, the different countries should continue to be very restrained, and their attitudes should be encouraged to be much more rational. And also, on the other hand, that much more efforts for peace should be introduced, should be intervened to bring different countries, conflicting parties much closer for the negotiation table. And so that's why I think maybe more possibilities of the coming back of peace would be more likely once much more peaceful efforts be introduced and peaceful negotiation be encouraged. And we hope, of course, these things will make achievement and will make breakthrough for different conflicting parties.
It may be becoming more and more confusing because Trump earlier warned that Israel could be left to fight alone if it resumes war with Iran. But just a couple of days later, the United States launched strikes against Iran. How should we understand this? Is this a shift in Washington's position?
I think United States President Donald Trump's rhetoric should not be taken too seriously because actually we know that the so-called unbroken alliance between United States and Israel is so strong, and they could not be easily violated by just some kind of the leader's personal division. So that's why the resilience of the bilateral relationship between United States and Israel is still very strong. But also, I think we cannot underestimate the United States division with Israel because they have different visions and understanding and perspective of what should be done to Iran, of what kind of the future scenario should be maintained in this region. So that's why the division become more and more clear. And from United States perspective, the protection of Israel is their kind of so-called national obligation. Let's be frank, their so-called national obligation. So they will continue to support Israel's national security and help protect Israel. And also, on the other hand, the recent attack, recent trade of fire between United States and Iran is resulted from their conflict and the clashes over the status of Hormuz. It means that the United States want to have much more presence in the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran want to maintain their own dominant role in this region. So that's why finally lead to the latest round of conflict. Shows, as you mentioned, this kind of the confusing and the complicities. And I think this complicity, unfortunately, will continue unless we could reach a kind of the deal between different conflicting parties.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Wang Jin, an expert on Middle East affairs. Coming up, Britain to ban harmful social media for children under 16. This is World Today. Stay tuned. It is reported that Britain is set to announce a ban on harmful online platforms for children under 16. Worries over the impact of social media on mental health and online safety prompted Britain to hold a consultation on children's access to social media earlier this year. Curfews, time limits, and curbs on addictive design features are all under consideration. France, Denmark, and Poland are also considering tightening rules around social media use for children. And Greece announced it would ban access to those under the age of 15 from the beginning of next year. For more, we're joined by Mike Basting, China observer and senior lecturer at the University of Southampton. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Basting.
Thank you. Hello.
So first of all, do you think the usage of social media by young people around you is concerning?
Extremely concerning. It has been for a very, very long time. Child safety campaigners have been making the point that the children, 13 to 16-year-olds, are vulnerable. There's access to nude images, being able to send it, save it, amid widespread concerns of that can lead to online grooming and this concept of sextortion, and tragically that has happened with tragic consequences. So it's extremely concerning. I think the UK government are trotting out a poll that they launched that 9 out of 10 parents who responded are in favor of very, very serious and robust action against social media as soon as possible. So very concerning.
Now, Britain is preparing to ban children under 16 years old from getting on harmful online platforms. What concerns do the policymakers have, and why is it so urgent now?
Well, it's urgent now because this has been under discussion for many, many years, perhaps more than 1 or 2 decades, and very little action seems to have been taken place. The high-tech companies, their business models are not really compatible with protecting and particularly protecting children from harmful images, nude images and pornography. They won't admit to that, but their profits will take a dive. And there's been a lot of pressure on the government to do something. They've been talking about this for a long time, but haven't done much. So they're now appearing to rush out legislation with some sort of blanket ban next week. We'll see what that actually entails. And as you said at the start, quite a few other countries have already done this. Australia has, and quite a few. Greece are following suit, and maybe France and others will do soon as well. So it does seem to be very, very urgent, and we are seeing a lot of telling statistics and reports that suggests something has to be done very, very soon. It's not up to the tech firms. Things will not change if it's just left to them.
But one of the biggest challenges with this policy is to define what harmful content is. How should governments determine which services fall under such restrictions?
Well, that's an issue. Clearly, when it comes to nude images and the possibility of online grooming and chatting to strangers who could be anybody from anywhere of any age and pretend not to be, clearly that's totally unacceptable, potentially very, very harmful. But how far do you stretch that is an issue, and that perhaps is an argument or part of the argument for a blanket ban. That doesn't then come into consideration if you ban 13 to 16-year-olds from access to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter now, X, Snapchat, and limits on Google and Apple. Then you overcome that, and that really isn't an issue. So the blanket ban perhaps obviates the need to discuss where you draw the line. But clearly, when it comes to nude imagery and pornography, and it's now the case, government reports that on average, a 13-year-old is exposed to pornography in this country quite regularly. That needs to stop, and that needs to be banned.
Now, the authorities have considered various measures such as curfews, time limits, and restrictions on certain addictive platform features. How practical is it to enforce these restrictions online?
Well, that's another issue. It's not very practical. Circumventing these restrictions is something that people have found is not too difficult, and therefore, again, a blanket ban hopefully will get round that. So implementing this is a moving target. Technology is evolving, so it's very, very difficult to implement something that really or require these controls to actually do the job on their own. And perhaps the blanket ban is the only way forward that then can't really be circumvented in any technical way, and very, very serious and robust penalties for those companies that really are found not to have or allow technology to somehow circumvent this ban.
Now, supporters argue that the stricter rules are necessary to protect children, but some say these restrictions may limit young people's access to information and social connections because internet is a double-edged sword. So how can policymakers strike the right balance here?
Well, I think that's an issue going forward. I think that the blanket ban initially is just to protect children. If that leads to some sort of reduction in their ability to connect socially online, then perhaps that's the price worth paying. I think that's something that will be discussed later, and how you actually somehow find that compromise is something that needs to be worked out in detail. I think for now there's real pressure just to impose a ban because protection is more important. And many would argue that developing socially and social connections and friendships is not really something that can be done effectively online anyway. That should be done elsewhere. And schools have taken it upon themselves to be more and more strict about banning the use of mobile phones during the school day. So maybe that's actually not such a bad thing as well. Young children, teenagers can develop friendships in the way that people of my generation used to before the technology was around.
And finally, very briefly, within 1 minute, how can the other parts of the society help children develop healthier digital habits?
Parents obviously need to impose strict controls, make sure to enforce those, and access in the parental accounts. Schools as well highlight the damaging effects and take phones away from school children, which I think they're doing more and more. So schools, parents can play their part. And also the wider community, the damage that social media takes, the addictive nature, not just when it comes to harmful material and the limitations that places on a child's overall development.
Thank you very much, Mike Baston, Senior Lecturer at the University of Southampton. That's all for the time with this edition of World Today. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.